Good afternoon, and welcome to today's lunch program for the 2021 New Jersey Planning and Redevelopment Conference, Geography of Equity and Inclusion, the Big Picture. My name is Meishka Mitchell. I am Vice President of Cooper's Ferry Partnership in Camden, and I am Vice Chair of the Board of Directors at New Jersey Future. I am honored to be able to introduce this topic today, as for New Jersey Future, the topics of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI as we call it for short, is really ingrained into the work that we've been doing, particularly in the last few years. Looking at New Jersey Future from an internal perspective, as well as our programmatic activities to make sure that we are incorporating those values across the state of New Jersey. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors that help make this conference possible. Thank you to our title sponsor, PSEG, our academic sponsor, Rutgers University's Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, and community builder, Maraziti Falcon. And thank you to our afternoon plenary sponsors, McManaman, Scotland and Ballman, New Jersey American Water Company, New Jersey Natural Gas, and PNC Bank. You can learn more about all of our sponsors by going to the sponsor tab on the conference website and visiting the exhibitor hall. And don't forget to complete your attendee profile in order to best connect with other attendees. As we all know, New Jersey is a racially and economically diverse state, but is also a geographically segregated state. New Jersey is a place where you'll find one of the richest places in the country, as well as one of the poorest places in the country. And as someone who hails from one of those poorest areas, Camden, New Jersey, I know firsthand how a zip code, where you live and where you're born, can dictate your access to open space, your access to drinking water, clean drinking water, and your access to opportunity. Today's plenary will explore what a geography of equity and inclusion would look like in New Jersey and how we might be able to get there. I'd like to introduce two of my fellow New Jersey Future board members to give their perspectives on this important topic. Chris Brown is the Director of Community Development for the City of Hoboken and an active member of the American Planning Association. And Joe Maraziti is the community builder sponsor of this conference, a longtime supporter of APA New Jersey and New Jersey Future, and partner in the law practice of Maraziti Falcon. Chris, thanks for joining us today. Given the title of our session, what does geography of equity and inclusion mean to you?
Thank you, Meishka. And I guess that the way that I would answer that question is framed within the City of Hoboken. I'm currently sitting in City Hall, so any answer, all of my thoughts during the day when I'm here in City Hall are framed within that lens. The City of Hoboken's a fairly affluent community, a lot of upper middle class households, a lot of professionals that work in finance in New York City. But it's changed over the last few decades. In the 70s and 80s, it was a more working class town with fairly higher percentage of people of color living within the city. And it's funny, we're working on a project right now where we're partnering with CIS, and the site where the development project is located was burned down in the fires in the 70s, and a lot of people were displaced during that time. So that's kind of the framework of Hoboken's sort of transition to where we are now. And our master plan was prepared in 2018 and thoughtfully considered how our zoning ordinance has contributed to the proliferation of larger and expensive units within the city. Our current ordinance in one of our districts promotes units that are about 1,500 square feet per unit. That's a fairly large space within within the typical lot within the city. So one of our initiatives here is to promote a diversity of housing options within the city by tweaking the zoning code to allow for smaller units, and in addition to just having affordable units. Having that diversity of housing types would attract a larger segment of people to live within the city. And one of the things that in my role here within the city, and one of the things that my staff and the mayor of Hoboken really contemplates is for improving or increasing the range of affordable housing options that are within the city. And we think about from just a personal level, thinking about geography of equity and inclusion over the last year. America has really sort of seen this empathy gap, and I think that when you have people, when you're not living when you're not living close to people, when you have when your neighbors are not reflective of the larger segment of society, there's a lack of empathy that can develop. And we really see that. We've really seen that in the last year. So that's something that's personal to me in my position here, and something that we've looked to increase within the city. So yeah, I'm very fortunate to work for a mayor that is a person of color and has that empathy and supports supports that level of community building. And so that's my personal take on the term geography of equity inclusion.
Thank you, Chris. Certainly, I appreciate that sentiment. When we're thinking about housing as being central to that discussion, New Jersey has always been central in the discussion around equity and inclusion with the Mount Laurel decision. So it's important to note that. For Joe, for the professionals who work in redevelopment, how can we promote equity using the local redevelopment and housing law? Joe, you got your mute on.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the question. And I want to first say that you can see, having listened to Chris, why I enjoy working with him on redevelopment in Hoboken so much. So I come to the topic certainly from a different place as a lawyer. And so thinking about your question, I went to the local redevelopment and housing law, the statute, and it wasn't surprised to find in the legislative findings that redevelopment is not only about the physical transformation of locations, but the findings by the legislature was that one of the goals of redevelopment is to promote social improvement. And so that fits right into this conversation. And I come to the issue of negotiating redevelopment agreements with that thought in mind, that it's not only about the project for the developer, it's about the impact on the community. And there is, through redevelopment, as distinguished from the municipal land use law, the opportunity to negotiate community benefits as part of the project deal. And the way we approach that is by having pro formas reviewed by professionals to see what is possible to share in terms of the financial benefit of the development. And so that gets translated into amenities for the community that the courts have said, as long as you can demonstrate a nexus between the project and the amenity, it's legally enforceable. So examples in Hoboken, there is a project where a multi-million-dollar public gym was provided by the redeveloper for the community. And that gets to Chris's point about being in communication with people of other nationalities and races. It brings people together. In addition to that, in Perth Amboy, we have successfully negotiated as part of a Home Depot warehouse, the construction of an amphitheater on Raritan Bay that will be open to the public, and other amenities that gather people of all races and colors, not just providing access to the project, but providing access for the community. And one of the main issues for equity in redevelopment, which is often overlooked, is that the remediation of the environmental conditions, which so often go hand in hand with the redevelopment project, are ones that benefit the community at large, and typically benefit most often communities of lower income that are in the areas where there is need for redevelopment. So being mindful of these opportunities and promoting the idea that amenities of this sort can be obtained for the community is one of the things that makes me so excited to be part of redevelopment. And as well, Meishka, I'm so proud to be part of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee with you on the New Jersey Future Board. And I'm anxious to hear what the panel has to say to expand on this theme. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both. And it's a pleasure serving with both of you on the board of New Jersey Future. Hopefully everyone is taking this time like it's a normal lunch session at a conference and has their lunch in front of them as they're going to enjoy our next keynote speaker. There will be an opportunity to post questions via the Q&A function, and panelists will have an opportunity to respond at the end of this plenary. Today's keynote speaker is Calvin Gladney, President and CEO of Smart Growth America and a nationally recognized thought leader on the equitable and sustainable revitalization of communities. Calvin has been a practitioner and policy expert and has worked in public, private, and nonprofit sectors over his career. Calvin graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School and is LEED's a lead accredited professional. He is trustee of the Urban Land Institute, a board member of the Center for Community Progress, and serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Masters in Real Estate program. Calvin, welcome to the conference.
Thank you, Meishka. And I wanted to also thank my board member, Pete Kasabach, for inviting me to speak today. And I really wish I could actually be in person in town talking to everyone rather than doing this virtual, but we will do the best we can. I have a couple of things I'd like to say as part of my keynote. I did want to add, though Meishka gave you my formal background, one thing that isn't in there is that I grew up in public housing in a small town called Brooklyn, New York. So I try to mix a bit of lived experience with what I'll talk about today in terms of the geography of equity and inequity. And frankly, I'll just say I grew up and I lived in it. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll kind of go from there. Another thing I'll say, as I always like to mention, at least if you're on social media and you want to have this conversation concurrently, that's my Twitter handle, also Instagram as well. But I'm very excited to be here, talk about equity and inclusion and how that relates to geography, and give you a sense of the big picture, how we've seen some things nationally. I say nationally, and so I want to take a quick step back and just introduce you to Smart Growth America, as well as in addition to my introduction to myself. Sorry, this is, here we go. Smart Growth America, we're a national nonprofit. Like I said, your very own Pete Kasabach is on our board for many years and has been great and insightful. But we have a reason for being, and that is to help create a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, that's prosperous and resilient. And as you can see from that North Star, that sort of reason for being, equity is built into our DNA. It's why we exist and why we spend the time to center racially equitable outcomes in all of the work that we do. Can take that North Star, but also how do we do our work? And we try to combine technical assistance, doing consulting, going places, sharing best practices, along with advocacy, and then frankly, trying to be thought leaders and bringing out and pushing folks on ideas. And I hope to sort of push everyone who is here today to a certain extent. One other thing, Smart Growth America is sort of the umbrella nonprofit, but you may have heard of some of our sort of sub-brands or teams separately. So you may know of our Locus, National Coalition of Triple Bottom Line Developers and Investors. You may have heard of the National Complete Streets Coalition, our advocacy and technical assistance organization, Transportation for America. So in some ways, we're an umbrella of organizations. And so you may have met or heard of some of the other folks in our, call it SGA family. So just wanted to share that just in case you were like, who's SGA? But we work nationally, but we're headquartered in Washington, DC. So wanted to start with, we did we partnered with the Brookings Institution and did a report just at the fall of last year called The Great Real Estate Reset. And it talks about how there are a number of changes and things that are happening around the country that really are going to disrupt everything we do. And the question is whether the real estate industry and the rest of planning, politically elected officials and alike are ready for those changes. And I mention that because one of the big things that we mentioned in this report is the idea of segregation, and that ultimately segregation has increased over time. And so when we talk about these spatial questions, we talk about the geography of equity and inequity. One thing we've seen, and I wanted to sort of give you the data to back this, is that actually we are getting more segregated year over year. And that partially has to do with how we've moved from a country that had mainly everyone, sort of an even balance, if you look in the 1950s on this slide, between folks that lived in the quote city and folks that lived in the quote suburbs, that we now have this disproportionate amount of folks, if you're looking at 2018 numbers, a disproportionate population that lives in the suburbs in the country, as well as a disproportion of the folks that live in the suburbs, particularly of the white population, who are actually only mostly in the suburbs. So what this means is not only were we segregated to begin with, and we'll talk a little bit about that history of segregation that goes way back, but actually that we've gotten more segregated over time. So, and unfortunately, a lot of that inequity follows who lives in certain geographies. So this is something that's happening around the country. And it's something that it sort of has just creeped up on us. And one of the things I want to talk about today is there are things that you can do, whether you're a planner, you're an elected official, you're someone who's an advocate that believes in these issues, you work for a government, so you're a government official, not necessarily elected, but maybe appointed or work for staff. There are things that you can do. And this is not a moment when we think about inequity to say, well, we're waiting for the savior. We're waiting for that great leader. What I want to implore of you today is to say that the time is now for you to do what you can do where you sit. And everyone who can hear my voice today has a place in this game in terms of what you can do. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. But I wanted to give you this backdrop of segregation and inequity and some of the things we've seen nationally. This is just another sort of example of that. This slide basically talks about climate risk. And, there's an intersection between inequity, racial inequity, and what's happening in terms of climate change. And frankly, the climate risk that's happening to Black and brown populations around the country. And essentially what this slide shows is the places where we are building the most, the places that we are seeing the greatest population change are actually the places that have 3.2 times the climate risk. And what you can see is if you go to Broward County, Florida, and other places, those are places oftentimes that are disproportionately where poor people live. So even though the headlines might talk about, boating communities where very rich people live right on the water, oftentimes the history of the United States is we put poorer people of lower wealth, in the places where there was the most climate change risk, or at least near bodies of water, near the beach. I told you my personal story. Well, to give you a little more detail, not only did I grow up in Brooklyn, but I actually grew up in the Coney Island neighborhood of Brooklyn. And as you all probably remember Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy, I got to see, unfortunately, firsthand what happens when you put lower income, poorer people, more vulnerable people, and those folks are moved right into the areas where if there is climate change and you see the effects of superstorms and hurricanes and the like, you can see this in New Orleans and a lot of other places. And so this issue, one of the things they're seeing, and again, this is the type of thing that creeps up on us, is that poor folks with lower income or lower wealth, are actually being placed in the places that have the most climate change risk, and therefore have the least resilience financially and otherwise to climate change changes. So we have to think about these issues in terms of inequity, not just in terms of economic inequity, but inequities in terms of our ability to be resilient and to be able to adapt to and mitigate climate change. One other example of this sort of broader set of issues when it comes to how we've dealt with populations of poor people and sort of the challenges, again, sort of another example of the geography of inequity, is what this visual shows. This is actually Minnesota, but you can actually show this, and this is sort of an analysis we did. But basically this visual shows, if you look in the top right corner, is we've built a lot of parts of this country where poorer households have to live farther away from jobs, and they live farther away from jobs and they have less accessibility to transit to get to those jobs. And so the geography inequity is not just geography, it's also our transportation infrastructure. It's our public transit infrastructure. It's our housing infrastructure and where people can afford to live and where we're building housing. And so ultimately, this geography of inequity is a culmination of not just historic discrimination, but of the investments, disinvestments, and decisions we've made even in current times. And you can see just in this map that basically the folks who have higher levels of poverty live farther away and have the least accessibility to jobs by transit. And so this is just another example of how you can think about the geography of equity or inequity, and think about that it's not just geography alone, it's the things that we do in terms of transportation, housing, and other types of infrastructure. One more example of that, and wanted to sort of put a particular New Jersey spin on this, and I heard a couple of comments earlier about affordability and affordable housing. What this bar chart shows is the percentage of low-income units by state. This was an analysis that we did of low-income housing tax credit projects, and essentially taking where we've put in low-income housing tax credit projects, which are ultimately affordable housing, and compare that to their ability to access public transit. And what you find, unfortunately, is, and you can see this in this bar chart, that most places in the country, we are generating low-income units farther and farther away from actually good transit accessibility. And so the problem there is, and this is another example of that geography of inequity, is that we are ultimately dooming people to a life of longer drives, which has public health, economic mobility, and just the ability to get around during disasters is another example. And we are sort of doing that particularly when it comes to households with lower wealth. And so you might be thinking to yourself, well, where is New Jersey on here? If you can't see it, let me give you a little arrow, and New Jersey is not doing well in this regard and compared to other states. So how can we make decisions differently so we're not citing people and I mean that in the CITE sense, or SITE sense, we're not placing lower income folks with lower wealth farther away from transit that can help them get to jobs, help them get to amenity, and help them get to the places where they need to be. Now, I won't totally beat up on New Jersey. So I'll show you one other part of our analysis. And this was thinking about low-income units and whether they are located within what we'll call walkable places. So again, this is an analysis of where low-income housing tax credit projects ended up and whether they're in at least an average walkable place. And in this regard, New Jersey has done much better. So wanted to just show you that we have to continue this trend, because you can see that there are many states are doing poorly here, that we have to think about our decisions and not just let these things play out, but every decision we make about housing, infrastructure, transportation, environmental protection, how we deal with climate change, really does contribute to the geography of inequity or contributes to the geography of equity. And there's no neutral ground. Either you're making a decision that is going to promote equity, or it is a decision that is going to exacerbate inequity. And you have to think about it in those ways. Just wanted to continue this conversation and talk about bugs. And I know some of you are going, what? What are we talking about? We're going to talk about bugs, but we're going to talk about bugs today. Wanted to give you a little bit talking about history, and I know a lot of you know this, but I think it's always worth talking about, which is when we think about the history of how we've made these structural decisions. So I gave you all those pieces of data and maps and visuals that talk about the geography of inequity. The question is, how do we get there? And this, I'm just going to go around the country and give you a couple of big structural examples. One of those examples is that we created zoning regimes around the country, and I know this is an issue in New Jersey, where we disproportionately have single family housing type zoning, but we didn't get there by accident. A lot of that zoning was done on the basis of race. And this was just an example of a blatant example of that, where even in the newspaper, it was sort of acknowledged that the point of the zoning regime was to segregate the country. And so a lot of our segregation, the geography of our inequity, really goes back to how we've zoned neighborhoods and what we allow, and whether we've created a zoning regime and then the approvals process that goes with it that doesn't allow for Black and brown people to be in the places with the most economic mobility, with the most communities of opportunity. And that is something that has happened by virtue of the zoning. Another example of this that you're hearing more about, that we've talked about, and we actually did a proposal on this, is the idea of the interstate highway system in the 1950s, and how all around the country, and I can give you a picture like this, I can give you 100 of these pictures. This is just an example of the Overton neighborhood in Miami, Florida, which at the time was known as sort of the Harlem of the South. And it was a vibrant Black and brown neighborhood with a vibrant main street. Reminds you of Tulsa and Greenwood as you hear about those stories. And this is an example of the interstate highway system, not by accident, but by design, being run through this neighborhood. And Overton went from this thriving, economically prosperous neighborhood and district to what is now one of the lowest income areas in Miami. And that was an example of the interstate highway system and basically structure and infrastructure investment getting us to this place of the geography of inequity. And the last example I wanted to talk about in this regard is redlining. And I know a lot of you know a lot about redlining, but I wanted to talk about one correlation and one thing that may not get as much detail when it comes to redlining. And wanted to take you not too far from where you probably sit if you're in New Jersey to Philadelphia to give you a very specific example. So a lot of you have probably seen these redlining maps before and know a little bit about the story. And it comes from the book, The Color of Law, with my buddy, Richard Rothstein. And The Color of Law laid out these redlining maps and talked about how neighborhoods were redlined around the country. And I think you all know that redlining was, these maps were created by a federal agency that basically said, you shouldn't invest in these areas where we've put these shades of red. And once they denounced those areas, and basically denounced them by saying that they wouldn't provide insurance and backing for mortgages in those areas. And then a series of disinvestments happened after that. You probably know that story, but there are correlations, and part of acknowledging the history is not just knowing the history, but knowing its relevance to today and how we end up where we are now, and its relevance for how we need to make decisions going forward. And so I'm going to take you down the road to Philly just to talk about that really quickly. Redlining map, this is the great city of Philadelphia. And you can see the areas that were redlined there. And those were areas, not by coincidence, but by design, that were the Black and brown areas of the city. And you can take a redlining map around the country, and there's no accident about where places were redlined. It was done on a race basis. And so this is also a map of Philadelphia that shows the average temperature difference between neighborhoods. And basically what this map shows is the places that are more red are the hottest parts of the city. And they're the hottest parts of the city because they didn't get investments in terms of tree canopy. They didn't get investments in terms of, you know, porous pavements, surface reflective areas. You have lots of concrete. You have very few coverings that aren't tree canopy, but would provide shade. And one of the things you'll find is these hottest areas are also the poorest neighborhoods in the city of Philadelphia, disproportionately. And one thing you'll see, and this is where the history relates to the current issues of now in two ways. One is these hottest areas of the city, and sometimes you can talk about the concept of a heat island effect. So you almost get a doubling down of these issues. So that's one problem. So climate change exacerbates these issues. And so you have these poor areas of the city that now, because of climate change effects, actually get even disproportionately hotter. But what you also see is there is a direct correlation between the places today that are hottest and where we redline in the future. And you can do this analysis in cities around the country. And my buddy Jeffrey from the Science Museum associated with the University of Virginia, Jeffrey Hoffman, did an analysis of all of these. So you can probably find that analysis to find more about any city that you're interested in. But you can see that the history of redlining as a starting point led to long decades of disinvestment and lack of investment. Again, geography and equity follows through, and the past became prologue. And it's not just whether places are hotter. And again, hot additional heat ends up with public health effects. People have disproportionate asthma, high blood pressure, heart attacks, and the like. So it's not just, well, oh, it's hotter and that's not that bad. It's people are dying more because they're in these places. But what you'll also find is another analysis, in the city of Philadelphia did this themselves. The places that were redlined are also the places, and you can see that in the bottom bar where it shows the word D, hazardous, which is what they labeled the red line areas in history. The places where you have the most homicides in the city of Philadelphia are also the places that they redlined, basically creating disinvestment, creating these negative clusterings. These are the places where you see homicides happen. And that has negative results because ultimately, every time you have a homicide in an area, it reduces the property values and the home values in the area. So you have this negative cycle that starts from redlining, starts from systematic zoning, starts from all these highway infrastructure projects going through Black and brown neighborhoods. And that history leads us to where we are today. And again, making the point that you can't be neutral. We either have to make decisions that promote equity, or it actually will exacerbate all of this history that have led to the geography of inequity. And so I just wanted to walk through you how that has happened. And I talked about this story, we're going to talk about bugs. And the reason why I said we talked about bugs is sometimes we talk about the system And we say, oh, well, that's a bug in the system. And the reason why these folks are poor is because we made some mistakes in the past, but we can fix those now. And it's not a bug in the system because it's a feature of the system. The system of how we've designed and made political decisions, transportation decisions, housing decisions, infrastructure investments, climate-related investments, systematically, it's been unfortunately based on race, sometimes white supremacy, and sort of steeped in racism historically. And so it is a feature of the system to churn out inequity, to churn out a geography inequity. And the only way to get somewhere different is to actually get to a different set of results. So let me keep going here. So what can you do? You can do a couple of things. If you're an elected official or you're working in the government, you can legislate for equity. So you can think about legislation and not just say, well, man, how is this going to happen? But if you're an elected official or you're working for the government, and Councilmember Kenyon McDuffie in Washington, D.C. did this, where this is an act that actually focuses on racial equity and says we need to analyze racial equity and how things are happening in various legislative actions, but also the investments that we're making. So part of it is to not be neutral and actually do things legislatively where the outcome definitively is supposed to be a racially equitable outcome. So that's one thing you specifically can do. The second thing you can do, as we talked about, is acknowledge both the history, but acknowledge how it affects what we do today, where we are today, and that we have to make decisions that acknowledge that history and incorporate it. Otherwise, we exacerbate the problems. And then finally, we have to make decisions, make investments with equity in mind, and frankly, centering racially equitable outcomes and fixing racial disparities as the core reason why we make the decision. And just two quick examples of this. This is a map that was looking at, well, here are different examples of where we could put a new set of lanes for public, basically bus routes. And what this analysis shows is you can make decisions, and the red shows it, where if you put the bus route in this particular area, you actually specifically benefit lower income households in a way that's better than if you put the bus lane in a different place. And so you have to actually do the analysis, gather the data and say, well, how would this particular investment actually benefit the communities that we want to fight these racially inequitable disparities? How do we make a decision that looks at the geography of inequity and makes a decision that actually fights against it? And part of that is you actually have to gather the data, do the analysis up front before you make the decision. Another example of that is doing this on a mapping basis. This is Greensboro, North Carolina, but thinking about the combination of housing and transportation costs, analyzing that data and seeing where you can make different decisions that actually benefit the households that might appear to have cheap housing, but then have very high transportation costs. So it still becomes unaffordable, make the difference, different decisions based on that. And then finally, doing the type of analysis, and we did this in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and looking at, well, where is the geography of inequity in this area, and where do displacement risks potentially might happen as you do the things to revitalize. And so when you're thinking about revitalization investments, and I know that was talked about earlier, thinking about the displacement risk that would happen to low-income households. And the challenge is you actually have to do this analysis before you make the housing investment, before you make the transportation investment, before you make the infrastructure investment. So my main point here is that you can't cover your mouth, you can't cover your eyes, you can't cover your ears. Whether you're an elected official, a government official, you're a planner, you're a city worker, or you're an advocate, you actually have to say that racial equity and fighting against the geography of inequity is what you're trying to do. And then you need to legislate for that. You need to incorporate the history when you're making decisions on that. And you need to make different decisions that think about racial equity as the key outcome. And that's the way that you'll be able to fight the geography and turn it into the geography of equity and opportunity instead of the opposite. Thank you.
Hey, Calvin. Thank you very much. I don't know if I am on screen. And there we go. Hey. All right. Well, Calvin, thanks again for coming to New Jersey and for having this conversation with us. And it's only begun. We really appreciate everything that you're doing down in Washington as well. You know, while we're focused on New Jersey, it's great to know that people like you and Smart Growth America are working with our colleagues at the federal level and trying to give the support and the direction that we certainly can benefit from. We're now going to hear from 4 other individuals who each come to this topic from a slightly different perspective. And I want to, actually, Calvin, you can stay on and we'll ask the others to start to come on. But I also want to remind folks that if you do have questions, and these can be for Calvin or it can be for any of our new speakers who are going to be talking, just put it right into the Q&A and we'll have some time at the end to be able to cover those questions. So now it's my pleasure to introduce these other speakers as they're popping up. I want to start with Chris Estevez, who is president of the Latino Action Network. Next is Reverend Eric Dobson, who is the deputy director of Fair Share Housing Center. We have Renae Reynolds, who is the executive director at Tri-State Transportation Campaign. And David Troutt, who is professor of law and founding director of the Rutgers Center on Law, Inequality and Metropolitan Equity, CLiME for short, at Rutgers University. Everybody on and ready to go? All right. I'm going to start out. I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question. They're going to have a few minutes to respond, and then we'll get into more of a discussion afterwards. So Chris, this first one is for you. The Latino Action Network is the plaintiff in a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey, which claims that the state of New Jersey provides separate and unequal schools to minority children in violation of their constitutional rights, and that there is segregation in New Jersey public schools. What's your history around this issue, and what do you hope that the lawsuit will achieve?
Hey, Pete, thanks. And thank you, Calvin, for that presentation. It's great to see a lot of the stuff we're working on represented that way so clearly and visually and all that. For me, you know, this work is very personal. It's basically the story of my life. My parents came to this country from the Dominican Republic in the early to settled in the Bronx first, and by the early 70s, by 1972 or so, went to the country, which was Plainfield, New Jersey. But by 1972, Plainfield, New Jersey was already becoming a very a segregated city, a city where white flight had left everybody behind. The city was full of abandoned homes. White families had packed up and really abandoned their homes, just left, and were able to buy houses out in the suburbs, basically with no penalty, right? And so when I was a young child, I remember going around with my father and my uncles who were in the business of rehabbing houses through HUD programs and all that, and which would be sold by folks, but still at prices way below what they were before. And so, you know, at the time, I didn't understand any of this. I was a kid. But looking back on it, what I know now is that, you know, what was happening there was that, you know, the city started, you know, during my childhood was falling apart. The schools were falling apart. The books that we had in the early 80s said that Richard Nixon was still president, right? And we knew that we had inferior institutions, that we had inferior schools, right? In that sense, didn't know why as kids, right? But this was what was happening at the time. My mother, you know, some personal stuff, ends up becoming a single mother, raising all us kids by herself, working several jobs. But, you know, things start to get rough in Plainfield. And I think Calvin really illustrated a lot of how that happens, right? But again, we don't know that. And in order to try to get us to help me out, because I was being mother had to work, multiple jobs, started to get in a bit of trouble. And once my older brothers had grown up and were able to work and chip in, she was looking for a way to get me into an environment that would live. And so she teamed it up with my brothers and even one of my brother's friends, who all pulled their money together to get a little tiny apartment 2 towns over in Westfield, which was an affluent white town, but had very little rental, apartments. But they were able to find one. They put all their money together, and they did that so that myself and my sister could go to school there. And we recognized and we realized like the difference right away. All of a sudden, we were in a school, had all these resources. People had time for us. They had time to deal with me, right? And unpack all my stuff, because I got there full of anger, full of, rage, full of like, if someone said something to me, I wanted to fight them. And they were like, no, we're gonna put you in this program, that program, this program, teach you how to use your words and all that. Fight with your words, not with your fists. That's probably why I'm doing this work now, because I like to fight with my words now, right? But I probably had a little bit of survivor's guilt, because I'm going like, I'm getting all these resources, I'm getting all this help, right? But my friends back at home in Plainfield weren't getting this. And I wasn't, because I'm smarter than them, because these guys were smart. They were talented. They were all the above, and they weren't getting the same resources I was. So it bothered me while I was in high school. When I went to college, and I was in college, and my childhood friends, many of them were either dying or going to jail. It bothered me that, how come, why me, right? Why did I get this opportunity they didn't? And that really like led me to this school. And after I finished school, in terms of looking at, what's the difference here? Is it true that the teachers in the inner city are not as good as the teachers in the suburbs? I found that that's not true, right? Because even when I moved back to Plainfield and bought my house there and put my kids in school there, I saw that these teachers are good teachers. Matter of fact, they're teaching subjects while helping kids who are victims of concentrated poverty and the trauma that comes along with that. They're helping kids get food. They're helping them deal with trauma from their neighborhoods and from their, and from their homes, right? And these are not traumas that are caused because we, Latinos and African Americans are somehow, lesser people, and we have more problems because we have some sort of genetic disability or something. That's not what it is. What it is that, like Calvin was saying, right? It's like, they basically penned us in, all the resources went out, locked the door behind them and say, you can't follow, right? And then, but you're to blame if you don't succeed at the same level as the other people, right? And so that's what motivated me to get involved in all this. Started working with Fair Share Housing when we created the Latino Action Network to work on the housing, the building of affordable housing beyond these borders, to try to create more opportunities. And in New Jersey, they were doing everything they could to not build affordable housing, to not desegregate housing. And through the courts, we were able to like kind of get that unjammed a little bit. But I remember talking to Eric and the others at Fair Share and saying, okay, now that we got that log jam kind of broken down, how long is it going to take to desegregate, right? In order to start to fix this, how long before we were able to and it was going to take decades. Even if we got shovels in the ground today, it would take decades to see the real difference. And that wasn't fast enough, right? Because we have kids, generations are going to grow up under these conditions. So we put our heads together, looked at, okay, in the meantime, could we at least get for kids the opportunity I had, right? To be able to go to school somewhere else while you're waiting for the housing to catch up to, right? And, what we saw was that in New Jersey, and as was already said, this is, segregated states in the nation, and it's not getting less segregated, it's getting more segregated, right? And so we're going to, challenge this in the courts with the Latino Action Network versus State of New Jersey. And the purpose of the lawsuit to basically what we had under the Abbott case was that we got funding So we ended up with Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal in terms of funding. And we're trying to do here with Latino Action Network versus the state is to realize the promise of Brown, where we have real, real integrated schools. And then hopefully we'll have housing that follows. Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much, Chris. Really appreciate the insights and your story as well, and sharing that story. And actually is a good segue into to Eric as well. So Eric, Fair Share Housing Center has been at the forefront of litigation to enforce the Mount Laurel Doctrine that requires municipalities to provide their fair share of affordable housing. What does good look like? Where is this working best, and why?
Great question, Pete. Thank you for having this. Thank you, Calvin, Chris, and all my other colleagues on this presentation. Yeah, I think we've seen a lot over the years, and of course, the Mount Laurel Doctrine have gone through this is round 4 now, I believe, and have been through some iterations through COA working and COA not working. But now we're at the place where the New Jersey Supreme Court decision in 2015 has allowed for major zoning, rezoning, or overlay zoning and inclusionary zoning through over 330 municipalities throughout the state of New Jersey. And so what good design and equitable development and transit development looks like, it looks like it in towns like, I'll give you a few names of towns who are doing this well. One is South Orange. Mayor Sheena Collum has done an amazing job with the work that South Orange is doing in that region of New Jersey. South Orange is a phenomenal model for how affordable housing gets done and gets done well. Of course, over the years, we've had struggles and fights with Mount Laurel, but there's no other better place than the Ethel Lawrence development in Mount Laurel with Peter O'Connor and Fair Share Housing Center, Fair Share Housing Development has done. So Mount Laurel is a good town. Metuchen, there's some great work being done in Edison, Woodbridge, Robbinsville. I was in Robbinsville yesterday for the ribbon cutting for Project Freedom Village. Robbinsville has done a phenomenal job of integrating affordable housing into market rate housing and mixing it into the community where you don't even know it. I mean, so it looks like, to answer your question, Pete, it looks like that the affordable units looks just like every other house in the community, and it blends in very well. Hamilton, and I have to give Cherry Hill kudos after fighting with them for 40 years. They've seen the light, and Cherry Hill has some phenomenal affordable housing products that are being produced in Cherry Hill. Just some great work that's being done around the state. And I think people, to Calvin's point and to Chris's point, people are starting to get, particularly younger folks, are starting to understand that they want to live in communities that are not segregated, right? Because we do know New Jersey is one of the most diverse states, but is also one of the most segregated states. And to Chris's point, it does take generations to break down those barriers. And since 2015 New Jersey Supreme Court decision, I think we're seeing a lot of growth in that area, and towns who are really looking back on this issue and re-examining this issue and see the opportunities to create housing for all its constituents, not just for the wealthy, but also for working class and low and very low income people. So that I will highlight those towns and a few others who are doing a good job. And I want to speak to the point that our first presenter, Chris, brought up about Hoboken. We actually helped Hoboken draft that inclusionary zoning ordinance that is doing really well in Hoboken, providing some affordable housing. And I understand the mayors want to increase it from 10% to 20%. So some of our urban regions are seeing gentrification or displacement, whatever you call it. Our urban regions need to do more in terms of creating inclusionary zoning ordinance to keep those long-term residents in our cities. So Hoboken has an ordinance, inclusionary zoning ordinance. Newark has one. So these are other towns that are doing well. Asbury Park just passed one. And I want to highlight, there are some towns who do, or some cities who do pass what I call fake inclusionary zoning ordinance, and that would be Jersey City, that have an inclusionary zoning ordinance that will allow the developer to buy out of it. So we don't recommend having an inclusionary zoning ordinance like that because it doesn't produce the housing. So in terms of an ordinance that produce affordable housing, that's the goal, because New Jersey needs more housing, particularly affordable housing.
Hey, Eric, thanks very much. And I totally agree with you about the inclusionary housing ordinances. And you guys have been on the front lines of getting good ones passed, and good luck with Jersey City. We're going to turn it over to Renae. Renae, you've worked on transportation and open space issues. Tell us about some of the ways that you have looked to create fair access to transportation and open space, and how are these connected? And welcome to Tri-State Transportation Campaign. For folks who don't know, Renae is a fairly new executive director.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks for that segue. I've been at Tri-State for a little over a month right now, so I'm very, very new. And I think I kind of want to start by giving a little bit of background from my New York perspective. So like Calvin, I'm also a New Yorker, and moved to a community that really resonated with some of the things that he talked about in his discussion. I live on the Rockaway Peninsula, so I'm in one of those coastal communities that have been affected by climate change and the impacts of Superstorm Sandy. And that was one of the first places that I started working with communities on access to green space. You would think that living in a coastal community with proximity to coastlines and open land, that you would see more activity from community members within that space. But after examining a little bit the history of the peninsula and the decisions that we're making to sort of concentrate populations of low-income communities in public housing on the peninsula, I think at one point the Rockaway Peninsula was had the most public housing in New York City at one point in history. And it's a really interesting history that you can read about in a book called Between Oceans and Cities, if you're so inclined. And so in 2013 and 2015, I was working with communities on the peninsula in the actually 2015 to 2017, and the post-disturbance of Superstorm Sandy, particularly with a community from the public housing complex Beach 41st houses. And they had lost use of a massive community garden that was destroyed by the hurricane, and that the housing authority had decided, was probably not as valuable to them anymore. So I worked with the United States Forest Service in their New York City Urban Field Station to sort of restore access to that space. So the notion being that access to green space could provide increased social resiliency through the development of new social networks and connecting communities, connecting neighbors to neighbors, providing better access to food through community gardening and urban farming, and also pursue healing and being, after people have experienced like the levels of trauma that a natural disaster can bring upon you, and oftentimes exacerbating those pre-existing inequities. So that was kind of like the first half of my career. And then I shifted into environmental justice and analyzing the link between transportation and environmental justice. And so my work prior to joining TSTC was with the New York City the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, looking at the ways that we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts of the transportation sector on our most vulnerable communities that are affected by asthma and all kinds of respiratory illnesses due to many of the planning decisions that left communities bifurcated by highways and suffocated by the pollution that comes from our transportation sector. And in addition to reducing the poor health impacts that come from transportation, we're also advocating for fairer access. One of the campaigns we allied on was the Fair Fares campaign in New York City to provide half-price Metro cards to low-income communities in New York City. So which brings me to my role here at the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. So TSTC has been a longtime advocate for mobility and accessibility and livability in the 3 states we represent, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And the organization has fought for better bus service, recognizing that New York and New Jersey, the primary users of transit buses are folks that are coming from our low-income communities and our communities of color. And so for a state like New Jersey, where the state's authority or agency on transit is statewide, yet the service doesn't reach every part of the state, we have to ask why. There are clear east to west connections to for our rail commuters who are trying to get to transportation hubs in Newark or trying to get into New York City. However, there remain transportation deserts in South Jersey in places like Cumberland and Salem. And so TSTC has been engaging transit riders to understand that their transportation needs more clearly and to craft the solutions to fix those gaps. And so one of the things that we've been advocating for is an overhaul of the New Jersey Transit bus network. Calvin showed that map about like where you can, how the choices and the decisions to put a particular bus route in a particular neighborhood can either lead to increased connections or lack of opportunities, whether through economic opportunities or opportunities to access green space, for example. And we've also been thinking about the ways we can reevaluate what we understand about like the importance of service and the service hours under which we, the parameters under which transit operates. So breaking out of that 9 to 5 on peak, off peak consideration in order to improve access to all New Jerseyans who work at all hours and every day of the week. So I think another way that I would make the link between access to transit or transportation and access to green space is through some of the active transportation campaigns we push. So increasing access to New Jersey's trail networks, for example. So TSTC is a member of the Circuit Trails Coalition, and we've been advocating for increased connections between rails to trails. And so I think, hearkening back to what I mentioned about like disturbance or natural disasters or the pandemic that we are still currently recovering from, one of the things that we noticed is that the pandemic brought to light the need for more access to green space. And so we've also been seeing an increase in the usage of bikes as a mode of transportation. So our approach to increasing access to both of these areas is focused predominantly on activating communities first and making sure that our policy decisions are aligned with the community needs.
All right, Renae, thanks very much. And thanks very much for highlighting the bus situation as well. I think a lot of people, when they think of transit, they immediately think of trains and don't realize that more people move on buses in New Jersey than in trains. So appreciate that. David, get to back cleanup here, our deep thinker. You've done considerable thinking, writing, teaching on this topic. What should we know that we might not know already about turning these concepts into practice? And what would it mean to center equity in our work?
Wow, thank you, Peter. It's really such a pleasure to be on this very deep thinking panel. And I do want to note that I am yet another former New Yorker on this panel. I'm a Harlemite who lived in Brooklyn also for many years. So many good things that one might touch on. So let me try to be brief so we can get to questions. And I thought what I would do is just sort of two things. One is to address this notion of how we might center equity. And I think we might center equity more broadly, at least in the state of New Jersey, but probably beyond as well, by thinking about the Mount Laurel doctrine as much more than a floor, a regulatory floor, but rather and much more aspirationally. Because in many respects, that's been the failure of one of the most important judicial moments in residential organization in the state of New Jersey, and the reproduction of racial and economic segregation and the profound inequality that has come from it. So what Mount Laurel does as a case is really to talk about the American dream and its casualties. And so, yes, it's a case about how zoning does this. Yes, it's a case specifically about exclusion and opportunity, but it's also very much a kind of a map for how place-based inequality or structural inequality works. That what makes a place desirable, what increases wealth and health opportunities for the middle class as they achieve the American dream, is not the magic of who they are, but the magic of the resources that flow from the institutions that are rooted in the particular places where they are fortunate to live. And so that is the map on which the Mount Laurel regulations are being drawn. It's a recognition that these institutions are most important, that the rules that created them, that the practices by which they work, and the norms that continue to inform their work over time have to be interrogated and ultimately have to be regulated. And so everyone, we've listened to a lot of these institutions being mentioned: housing policy, specific elements of housing policy, educational policy, transportation policy. All of these institutions, and we could really go on, are dependent upon certain practices that either feed them resources or retard those resources. And Mount Laurel recognized that those resources are fed through local sovereignty, through the power of exclusion, and through particular means for excluding others. And so planning and land use wind up being central in it, right? But the norms that animate those exclusions are also very important, right? And go somewhat unchallenged as a result of the doctrine. That's what I mean by Mount Laurel being thought of as a floor. We don't, for instance, we recognize in the American dream that white work is to be rewarded with wealth, right? That the income that comes from hard work is to be rewarded with a good, strong community, with housing values that appreciate, with access to transportation, to open space, to clean air, to good schools, to a strong tax base, right? We recognize that. But the corresponding norm that Calvin talks about in looking at the history of segregation was to negate all those things for Black people, to in fact redline those things, to covenant those things, to discount Black work, Black wealth, Black presence, and therefore Black resources, right? So we could really walk through a set of norms that we see coming out of the lay of the land that Mount Laurel addresses. It tries to address it in a regulatory way, sort of in the name of regional equity, recognizing that it's processes that produce this inequity, it's processes transformed that can produce more equity, as long as we're all willing to take on these obligations equally. And so we have a system that sort of aims at the floor. And so we have a system that tries to get municipalities and the various land use and other professionals who work for them to slightly alter the calculus, right? To sort of include a little bit of this almost charitable work, but for reasons that aren't particularly clear, other than if you believe in the state constitution, but not from a self-interested standpoint, right? And so what we really need to do in this age of equity is to recognize that the Mount Laurel doctrine is really about affirmative aspirations, right? It's not just about the least that we can do, but the most that we can think about doing to rectify this horrible past, right? To benefit all of our tax bases, to increase public health for all of us, to increase New Jerseyans' educational access, and to lift all of these boats together, because all of these communities made stronger makes all of us stronger. And this is just not yet recognized. So this is what equity requires. It requires doing this through the lens of overall fairness, through a recognition of a racial history of discrimination and tremendous hardship based upon land principles, which by their very definition are meant to last. And so that's what we're dealing with. So what do we do? Well, there are four things that I would generally recommend that we do, and Calvin touched upon several of them. The first is really a recognition that there is some mutual benefit to seeing an American dream in which housing stability is a right, in which income is rewarded, in which wealth is presumed, in which health must be maintained, that these things, sorry, my dog is trying to get in the room, that these things are critically important as governing norms. That secondly, that the acknowledgement of the harm that's been institutionally and systematically inflicted is not just something we say in passing terms. It's something that we actually have to study. And the great thing about planners, because I have a terrific planner who's a Blaustein recent doctoral grad, is that they love to study. And we can really figure out exactly which processes are primarily responsible for creating the affordability crises, for creating so many of the problems in environmental justice, et cetera. So we can really figure out exactly what it is we have to address. The third thing then is to use this analysis and the data that comes from these studies, and to really formulate goals and timetables, specific equity targets that we within our communities, whether it's the municipal level, the neighborhood level, the county level, the regional level, or the state level, are committed to trying to reach, and to be bold in those, to recognize, you know, as others have said, that these are cumulative disadvantages that have had profound effects, made much clearer in the midst of crises like the last year. And so we really don't have any more time. And so the fourth step then is, having studied the issue, acknowledged the problem, embraced new norms, and decided what our goals are collectively, we really have to engage in serious compliance, reconciliation, and accountability. It's just not good enough to say, we're going to try to do these things. But as we would do in any other regulatory regime, there has to be compliance. There have to be bodies established where people are responsible for evaluating the work as it goes, for modifying the means by which we meet those goals as we go, and for holding people accountable for the failure to meet those goals. So that's sort of broadly how I would recommend it. We've tried to do some of that in work in Newark, in the creation, for instance, of an Equitable Growth Advisory Commission. I'm fortunate to be on the commission, but the goal of a commission like that is to recognize that, yes, there's a terrific mayor in Newark who cares very much about equitable growth, but he has all the other conflicts of elected officials to worry about. He's trying to grow that city. He's trying to grow that tax base. He's trying to sort of find the investment that has been lacking historically in Newark, and creating crisis after crisis. And so it's hard to know exactly where to draw the lines on inclusionary zoning, on tax abatements, on the enforcement of community benefits, on exactly what we mean by affordability, those kinds of things. And so a cross-section of people with lots of different perspectives and lots of different experiences, but committed to articulated goals, to articulated principles of equity, are there to watch that progress and to check it at times and say, we think we could do better here. We think we could do better there. And here are some specific ways to get there. Thanks, Peter.
Oh, thank you, David. I think that was a great way of summarizing sort of a call to action and some specific steps. And actually, I'd love to just put that back out to the other panelists, and Calvin included. If, you know, given what David has just said and sort of in his closing part of his remarks, are there elements of that that resonate with what your experiences are, or what you think, you know, echo those next steps in your own words or in? Lord, everybody.
You know, I'm sorry, Pete, I thought you was specifically asking Calvin. I think, you know, David raised a great point about the aspirations of Mount Laurel, and Chris mentioned that it takes generations for it to evolve unless there's, you know, we've had this, and you all know that we've had this fight for many years with the allocation of the numbers, a number of units. But, you know, Mount Laurel was intended to deal with and to address racial, economic, and social segregation. And because of all that history that David and Calvin laid out, we had to, you know, break it down to the economic piece. But make no mistake that I think what America really failed to realize, and I think this is predominantly most of the population when it comes to housing, that we have created, socially engineered the white middle class and the white wealth. This was intentional to create white wealth and to the disadvantage of Black and Latino wealth. And so when we look at these issues that, you know, we can deal with this, like the David point to zoning, and but until we deal with the narrative around the entire real estate industry, insurance and banking and home ownership, how the racism that exists in that, until we deal with that in the narrative of how it's shaped and framed, we're still going to have this uphill battle, because many of the folks that is on this panel and many of the folks that are participating in this, whether you realize it or not, all of us, if we have a mortgage, live in subsidized housing. And so we don't, you know, so we like to look at subsidized housing as only a Black and poverty and a Latino issue, when most of the subsidies for housing and wealth creation go to the white working class and the upper middle class and upper income folks. So when we talk, and we need to talk about that, Peter, because I think people are under the assumption that you know, to Chris's point, that, you know, Black folks or Latino folks don't work as hard. Not only do we work, we have to work harder, but we get undercut by government programs and government subsidizing, you know, the white working class and upper income folks, and to our disadvantage. So the resources don't go to us, they advantage. And Dorothy A. Brown talks about this in the Whiteness of Wealth in her book that talks about the tax codes. Professor Keongo Yamada Taylor in her book Race for Profit talked about this. Edwin Glaser, who Triumph of the City, talks about how we continue to perpetuate the same problems over and over, and we wonder why, you know, Black home ownership haven't produced generational wealth for Black and Latino folks, because we set the system up so it wouldn't. And so David's outline and what he says steps that we need to do is absolutely correct. Again, if you have a mortgage, you live in subsidized housing. Let me say that again for all our 4,400 and something participants. If you have a mortgage, you live in the suburbs, you live in subsidized housing. You get more subsidies than poor people do. How about that?
Just another good example.
And I'd like to say, you know, when I talk to people that I know in the suburbs, and they say, well, it's unfair, you know, for us to have to do affordable housing in my town. You know, I paid for my house and I did this and I did that. And, you know, and they forget that, you know, their grandparents, you know, got subsidies, you know, in the 50s and all that to when these houses were first built, right? And that, you know, that they got helped along the way. They still getting helped. And we talk about, you know, creating some affordable housing. Even so that, you know, a first generation college graduate from a family of color can get their foot in the door, you know, they see that as like somehow an unfair advantage. And so that engineering, right, of, of white wealth, and then the engineering against, wealth for people of color is still a real thing.
And redlining didn't stop, years ago. It still goes on. Predatory lending, subprime lending, credit checks, criminal history checks that we just got that bill passed. So these are all the issues of modern day redlining that still exist, that's still going on. And to the planning industry, to David Trout's point, to the planning industry, and I like to highlight this because sometimes planner doesn't see this in the code of ethics, and I'm not blaming planners. And you get out of school and start your profession, that there's a code of ethics. You have an obligation to the public that's in the APA code of ethics to plan for integrated communities. That's part of code of ethics of planners. So when you're meeting with local town officials, you have a responsibility to tell them they need to not only comply with Mount Laurel, but be creative about ways to make sure there's racial, social, and economic integration throughout the state of New Jersey. That's in the code of ethics in the APA.
Well, let me ask, that's a good question to folks, so we have a lot of people, watching this panel that are involved in real estate in one way or another, whether they're municipal officials, whether they're planners, architects, developers. A lot of people are learning about these issues, sometimes for the first times, but others have, know about this over the years. You've heard about it, read about it. But how do we move from learning about it, knowing about it, and starting to be able to hold each other accountable for changes? So I asked that question to any of the panelists who would like to try to respond to that.
I'll jump in. I think part of it is you can think about, you have to start with the destination in mind, right? So if the destination has more than one part, and I think this gets to David's point, one of the parts of the destination is an equitable result. So a racially equitable result that closes the gaps on disparities. And I say that those two pieces because you can have a racially equitable result that does nothing about the 60-year head start that certain people have already had. Going back to Eric's point about the layering of, if you were if your great grandparents received money during the Homestead Act or received land given to them, that intergenerational wealth and capacity, you are leveraging to this day, irrespective of the individual activities you're doing now. So if you work backwards from that, then you have to think about, well, what can we do? And that's where I think you have to think about the outcome and think about all of the phases of the process that get you to that equitable outcome. And then, and this gets to David's point too, quantify the gaps in each phase, and then quantify what you want to do to change those gaps. So if you're a real estate developer, for example, not only should the development itself, that final outcome, be equitable in terms of maybe affordable housing or a mix of incomes, but let's also think about the retail that's on the bottom of the building. Well, are you disproportionately building the spaces in a way that it's very unlikely that a Black and brown business can be successful in that space? You have to think about that in the very beginning of the project and say, I'm going to build spaces that maybe are smaller, are clustered in different ways, have different ceiling heights, that have flexible wall spaces and the like. If your goal is ultimately the equity of not having every new retail space in your multifamily building look like every other retail space in every other city. And so you have to work backwards with that outcome in mind and say, I got to think about the retail. I need to think about every service provider I hire along the way. Are you hiring a Black architect, engineering firm, market analysis firm? Who's doing your title insurance? All of those are places where, and again, thinking about them in phases, that you have a moment as the developer to embed equity in each of those decisions. And so it might be that you're doing a development that isn't going to have any affordability in it. where are the other places along all the phases where you can embed equity in the results of each of those outlays of funds? And you have to do something extra. You have to say you mean it. And that might mean you might have to go beyond your usual circle of service providers and contractors that you already know that you use every time, and say, well, I'm gonna make my general contractor think about subcontracting decisions. And I'm not only gonna do it, to use David's point, as the compliance floor based on some city rule, but I'm gonna do it because equitability is the result I'm trying to get to. And in each phase, you can make those decisions. So wherever you sit, you can make decisions that change the game. And one other point I wanted to make that gets to Eric's point about individual reflection. If I was in the room with everybody right now, I'd ask folks, you know, did you buy a house in a neighborhood? And a certain amount of people would, actually, do you live in a neighborhood? But then I'd ask you to raise your hand and say, do you live in an integrated neighborhood? And what you'd find is, as many people who are super progressive in their job and everything else they do and what they say on Twitter, but they ultimately somehow ended up in a segregated neighborhood. So at some point you can look at yourself individually and say, did I make what might be the harder decision not to be individually part of the problem? And I would implore you to think about that as well.
Calvin, I think that's a great point. Renae, did you have want to add something?
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to build off a little bit about what Calvin said about the determining if the destination or the end goal is equity. That really determines the types of tools that you use, you know, as a planner. So for an example from transportation, oftentimes, like, and I promise I'm over time I'll have more New Jersey examples, but just thinking about New York, and New York being out of compliance with their ADA requirements when it comes to the transportation infrastructure, elevators, lack of elevators. And so one of the tools that transportation agencies in consorting with, you know, real estate has been to give like easements or give, you know, certain chips to real estate to develop over transportation infrastructure, as long as they pay for the elevator. And so the goal is to create access to folks with differing abilities to utilize public transit. But the end result oftentimes is an elevator that is not functioning, that no one has accountability over. So I think that really examining the sort of tools that we utilize when we're building our systems and whether they are in service of that actual end goal is a really good point to sort of emphasize and just show how it can be applied in so many different areas.
Great point. We have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. And so, but what I'd like to do is give everybody a chance to just give their quick, you know, if you want, you know, 30-second takeaway or something that you'd like to leave the audience with, and then we'll wrap it up. So Calvin, I'll start with you. You're top of my box.
Ask yourself a question every time you're going to make a decision. How is the system doing? If you're making a decision that's just a tweak on the margins, but the ultimate outcome that the system is designed to churn out, which is currently inequity, will not change, then you're not really making the inroads that we all say we want to make. So as you think about a decision, are you just tweaking on the margins? And would the system go, that's nice, but you didn't really change anything I'm ultimately doing? So how is the system doing?
Great. Chris.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, in terms of these issues, in terms of looking at these things through a lens of equity, you know, it reminds me of when I was meeting with a legislative leader and he asked me to give him a list of Latino issues. And I started talking about housing and education and taxes. He goes, no, Latino issues. And I'm like, every issue is a Latino issue. I'm like, if you want, I'll put a sombrero on and I'll run around with maracas telling you about it. But every issue is a Latino issue, and every issue is a Black issue, and every issue is an Asian issue. And you know what I'm saying? So when, you know, one way that we start is when we're having these type of forums, that we make sure that the people that we want to include are included in the discussion so that you can hear that perspective, right? And I thank you for including me and hearing the Latino perspective here in this panel.
It's been great having you. Renae.
I feel like maybe reflecting on history. This was something that Calvin said, and I think that it's extremely important to reflect on the historical decisions that currently create and sort of project into the future if we are not able to grapple with the history and respond to it and change our path. So I think it's really being reflective about what has happened, what it means now, and what it'll mean in the future.
Excellent. Eric.
I'm going to ask a question that James Baldwin asked a long time ago, and I really need folks to reflect upon this question, right? And because America has created wealth for white Americans. And Baldwin asked the question, can you prove that you're white? Well, let me ask the question this way. When did you become white? Because when your ancestors came here, let's excluding African Americans, Latinos, when your ancestors came here, those who are of European descent, they didn't come here as white. They came here as Dutch, Irish, Italian. And so they came here Dutch, Irish, Italian, poor. And America created a system to take those folks out of poverty and classified or made this caste system called whiteness. And everything we measure around this country is based upon whiteness. And that has produced a lot of inequities. So I want you to think about, when did you become white? Because before you became an American, you were Italian, you were German, you were Irish, you were Dutch, whatever your nationality was. And you came here with nothing. This country gave you an advantage. And isn't that an advantage that, you know, culturally that you should be looking at and saying, how can I contribute, to Calvin's point? How have I contributed to the inequities and how can I fix it? So that's my question.
Good question. Thanks, Eric. All right, David, good to wrap it up.
Okay, so thank you. And such good points. Let me just return to resources for a moment. I know I was giving a good go to the problems of localism and local sovereignty and reproducing segregation through a kind of a non-racial and far more durable means. But let me ask people to take a hard look at what some people refer to as neoliberalism, and others may talk about as the rise of federalism. But some of what we're living through now are, again, the cumulative deficits that were, as Calvin rightly points out, designed in the system, but also politically motivated by an ideology where the federal government, the greatest resource of all, pulled back on what was really a vision of civil rights. And so that's got to be challenged. I mean, it's got to be challenged. We're 2 generations into that backlash, into that retrenchment, and we're seeing the vast inequality that it created. So the first is the federal government's got to get back into housing in significant ways and much more directly, and not simply rely on incentives to private actors to do it in a way that's profitable to them, because it simply doesn't reach enough people, and certainly not the poorest people. Secondly, we really have to enforce fair housing. And while we can do that at the state level, we can even do that at the local level, we've got to do that at the federal level, because it really changes people's behavior when they're concerned about what kinds of consequences they may face to their business and to their liberty. Third, we've got to deepen the subsidies. For anybody who's trying to do this work, you recognize that trying to make up for these various gaps is extraordinarily expensive. It's also extraordinarily complicated, which means fewer and fewer people can do it, which means it's much less likely to get done. right? So we've got to deepen the subsidies in some respects as reparations for the failure to invest in the past. And then finally, back to the local level, I think we've really got to think hard about changing the rules on the services paid for through our tax bases, through our local tax bases, because I think that tax-based inequality is in some respects the sort of self-generating problem that even for people of goodwill continues to perpetuate these unequal spatial and ultimately personal relationships.
David, thank you. Thank you all the panelists for participating today and for sharing all of your insights. I'm really glad that this was recorded, because I think we're going to want to go back to it again. And I think we've also changed this maybe from the geography of equity and inclusion to the geography of justice. I think there was a lot that, that we were talking about that isn't just about including people, but it really is about fixing some of the things that are broken and making up for them as well. So I thank you all again. To all of our audience members, you continue to join us in the afternoon for the panels this afternoon, and then tomorrow for Friday's second half of the conference. So thank you again all, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Peter.